you want a lift on Ural Airlines, there's a surcharge to land on a runway. Oh, Russia. The most recent incident occurred a month ago on September 12th of 2023 when an A320 which had departed from Sochi encountered a hydraulics problem resulting in the crew making a forced landing in a Siberian field. Now you'll notice that I said most recent incident. This isn't the first time that Ural pilots have been forced to land in a field. Jump in the time machine to the happy months before COVID and you'll find yourself on August 15th of 2019 where an early morning departure out of Moscow ended with a landing in a field. Initial reports indicated that the crew, much like Sullenberger on the Hudson, ingested multiple waterfowl during takeoff, which caused a loss of power in both engines.
Birds.
Whoa.
The pilots guided the aircraft into a field along the departure corridor. There were a few injuries, but no deaths. The initial response was one of glowing laurels. Putin gave them medals. Everyone celebrated them as heroes. Things are a little bit different in Russia. There's no hard and fast as to what constitutes an injury following an aircraft incident, but for what it's worth, the published number was 74 out of 233. The passengers were offered 100,000 rubles, which sounds like a lot, but it's only about $1,400 US. The accident aircraft in 2019 was an Airbus A321, which is the largest version of the popular A320 family. It's an airplane that I know pretty well. It's one I'm typed in and currently flying. The pilots in this case, heroes at first, eventually became Barney Fife villains, bumbling, stumbling sources of the accident. Media outlets contend that the final report was published in 2022, but it's never been made public. Portions of it were allegedly leaked to the media, however, which depicted a less than competent effort by the pilots. The captain allegedly stated that he witnessed birds on the runway prior to taxi. The crew stated to investigators that they had waited for the birds to clear the area before initiating takeoff. According to media outlets, the aircraft only paused for 10 seconds after it reached the runway before initiating their takeoff. This led some to speculate whether they had waited for the birds to clear the area before initiating their takeoff run. On the cockpit voice recorder, both pilots commented about the continuing presence of the birds during the takeoff roll. They were bothered enough by the foul that they cursed. The details are sparse here. It's unclear at what point in the takeoff run the pilots became aware of the birds in their path. In transport category jets, it's generally a bad idea to reject a takeoff above 80 knots unless the pilot perceives a serious risk to continuing. This is codified in regulations and aircraft-specific warning systems, many of which are inhibited during the takeoff run. If the pilots felt like there was a good possibility of hitting a large number of birds, it would be an acceptable reason to reject a takeoff above 80 knots. However, reports indicate that Russian pilots do not possess the same command freedoms as US or European pilots do. Pilots in the West are rarely under any threat of censure when their decisions are due to concerns about the safety of flight. Even if it can be demonstrated after the fact that they were overly conservative, they generally won't get into any trouble over it. The bird strikes occurred soon after takeoff and resulted in ingestion in both engines. The details here are a little contradictory, with some sources stating that one engine failed while the other continued to produce partial power, and other sources indicating that both engines were still providing partial power. The unpublished final report allegedly stated that the captain continued to apply rudder input after activating the autopilot, resulting in the autopilot disconnecting 6 seconds later. Now, if you read between the lines here, that would indicate asymmetric thrust after takeoff, as that would principally be the only reason why an airline pilot would apply rudder during the climb out. On the Airbus, when the autopilot is engaged, it has full control of the rudder. Pretty much all autopilots are designed to disengage if they encounter a certain amount of force on a control surface, such as a pilot stepping on the rudder. The procedure for an A321 is for a pilot to initially apply the rudder force necessary to optimize performance during a climb with a loss of engine thrust. On the Airbus, they make this pretty easy. A turn coordinator on the top of the attitude indicator turns blue. Centering it produces a most efficient orientation for the aircraft to climb, which, with asymmetric thrust, involves a little bit of residual yaw. The thing about it is, when you turn the autopilot on, you have to take your feet off the pedals. And the autopilot isn't designed to manipulate the rudder pedals in response to asymmetric thrust. It can handle turn coordination and yaw damping, but they don't want to give it too much control authority in the event of a malfunction. Now, there is rudder trim, but the trim knob is disabled with the autopilot engaged. What this means is that the pilot has to use rudder trim to reduce the pedal forces that are required to center the slip skid indicator prior to applying the autopilot. Got it? If it sounds complicated, after a few practice sessions, it isn't. But in live fire, it's the sort of thing that a pilot can screw up. There was apparently some degradation in airspeed at this point as well. I want to quote from the Russian article here so that you know what I'm dealing with. The plane was not balanced on the safe trajectory. The instrument speed fell, and the readings of the director's arrow on the pitch could not stand. So this is what I assume to be an AI translation dictated by Safari from Russian into English. Obviously not very nuanced, but I think it gets the job done. To understand what they're saying here, the Airbus flight director targets an airspeed during all takeoffs. The precise airspeed is dependent upon whether one or both engines are operating. Single engine speeds are a bit slower to facilitate a better initial climb due to the loss of engine thrust. Normal operating speeds provide a few extra knots as an additional margin when both engines are operating. The autopilot is designed to follow flight director commands. However, in this particular case, soon after the autopilot was engaged, it automatically disengaged due to the captain maintaining rudder pedal force. This is where it gets a little complicated again. In an Airbus, pitch commands do not produce a one-for-one effect on the elevator like they do in a conventional aircraft. Side stick input sends suggestions to a computer which calculates a load factor to apply to the aircraft. So without any stick input, the aircraft will attempt to maintain a zeroed vertical acceleration, which is to say that it will maintain its current attitude regardless of airspeed. In a climb attitude with the airspeed decreasing, and this will generally be the case immediately after takeoff, the computer will hold the pitch attitude regardless of diminishing airspeed. Now there are multiple stages of low speed protection on the aircraft, so slowing to stalling speed isn't a concern, but with one engine inoperative, slowing below single engine climb speed, referred to as V2, can reduce climb performance nonetheless. Also, reducing climb performance is a failure to retract the landing gear, which happened in this case as well. This is one of those things that I've seen in the sim before. Occasionally, especially during a surprise event such as an unanticipated go-around or engine failure, the pilots will forget to retract the landing gear. Most pilots, after a certain period of time, will catch up and correct for it, but an extra handful of seconds close to the ground can be vital due to the excess drag that landing gear produces. In this case, neither pilot initially recognized the failure to retract the gear. And then there's this. How Russians process job placement, apparently via a psychological battery wherein command decisions in highly dynamic environments are parsed for errors and then dissected by psychologists who, in all honesty, probably don't know much about flying an airplane in the first place.
It's not your fault.
In this case, they stated that pre-employment psychological tests were successfully completed by the pilots, not because they possessed the mental tools needed to fly an airplane, but because they were smart enough to fool the test. In other words, if the pilots made mistakes, it wasn't due to the limited usefulness of psychological tests, it was due to fraud. When you encounter incidents in kinetic environments, you have two options: blame culture or error mitigation. Again, this appears to be an area where Russia differentiates from the West, which long ago acknowledged that errors are a native part of piloting. You're gonna make mistakes. It's a continual theme in the accident database. It's why trapping and mitigating errors is so important. If you put yourself into a position where perfection is called for, you're going to end up in trouble. I mean, listen, if you want to get at it, Sullenberger wasn't perfect either. 30 seconds passed between the dual engine failure and the attempt to turn towards a runway. Simulator tests, and I've done this in a simulator myself, conclusively indicate that had the crew initiated an immediate turn towards LaGuardia, they would have easily made it back into New York. It's always easy to parse decisions in hindsight. On the spot, with shock and surprise, you're always going to find things that could have been done better. None of this is to say that the crew handled the situation optimally. The failure to retract the gear is problematic. So was not trimming the rudder pedal prior to engaging the autopilot and maintaining pedal pressure afterwards, which resulted in autopilot disconnect. I feel like I should point out here that this last element is an Airbus-specific procedure. Other aircraft I've flown in the past allow the pilot to trim the rudder with the autopilot engaged. The lack of procedural standardization between aircraft fleets is a real problem for aircrews. You never can quite eject everything you've learned from previous airframes. In high workload environments, you might find yourself drifting back to the procedures for previous aircraft. There were a few other things that bothered investigators. Believe it or not, they apparently determined that a lack of professionalism existed due to the pilots cursing the birds during the takeoff roll. The pilots landed in a field with the gear up, which they explained afterwards was intentional. This is one of those things that there is some debate over. There are some that argue that off-field landing should be made with the gear retracted, particularly if there's a possibility of soft sod. The idea being that gear down increases the odds of the aircraft tumbling after landing. That's why it's standard procedure to ditch with the gear retracted in the case of a water landing. On the other hand, the gear is designed to absorb impact forces. So landing with the gear extended will theoretically reduce the G-loading that passengers and pilots will endure during the crash. This seems to be the perspective of the accident investigators, who went on to question the truthfulness of the pilot's post-accident testimony. They noted in the cockpit voice recordings that the pilots belatedly retracted the landing gear in order to reduce drag. At that point, they were hoping that they could make it back around to the runway. There was apparently no additional conversation regarding gear configuration immediately prior to touching down in the field. At my current airline, we have a procedure for a forced landing associated with the dual engine failure in the A320. It dictates that the landing gear should be in the down position. Most of the emergency procedures that we have come directly from Airbus, so I suspect that this may be an Airbus procedure. Whatever the case, it's amazing how quickly you can go from hero to goat, especially in mass media. We have a few details on the second incident that occurred last month. While on final approach to Omsk, the crew initiated a go-around and reported a hydraulic failure affecting the brakes. The runway at Omsk is 2,500 meters or 8,200 feet. They made a decision to divert to an airport with a longer runway, 3,600 meters or 11,800 feet. The distance between the airports was around 370 miles. They had been able to retract the landing gear, but not the nose gear doors due to the hydraulic failure. The extra drag combined with strong headwinds apparently resulted in insufficient fuel to make it to the alternate airport. They didn't really get that close either. The field that they ultimately landed in was 110 miles from their intended alternate. According to aviationsafety.net, the crew reported the failure of the green hydraulic system. In the Airbus, as in most airliners, there are 3 separate hydraulic systems which provide substantial redundancy in the event of a single hydraulic failure. The main braking system on the A320 is controlled by the green system. However, every A320 that I've flown will automatically transfer braking to the yellow system in the event of a green system failure. Even with the green system failure, the 8,200-foot runway at Omsk should have been more than sufficient for the aircraft to land. In the event of a failure of both the green and yellow systems, the aircraft would have required in excess of 10,000 feet of runway, not just because of the brakes, but because of other components, such as spoilers, that would have been inoperable as well. It's good to note here that embargoes on Russia due to the Ukraine war have resulted in a shortage of Airbus parts for the national airlines. Some have suggested that this might have played a role in a potential and extremely rare dual hydraulic failure. But for now, initial reports indicate that only the green system had failed. 370 miles is towards the edge of what you can do with 45 minutes of reserve fuel in an Airbus, and if you're dealing with heavy headwinds, it's probably outside of it. Added to it, it sounds as though the hydraulic issue began when the gear was extended for landing. Following this, the crew initiated a go-around, accomplished the abnormal checklist items, and calculated a landing distance that indicated that the runway was too short at Omsk. All of this while burning off fuel. It's important to note here, too, that landing distance computations and complex aircraft can quickly become befuddling. It's very easy to refer to the wrong chart, say the green and yellow system failure chart as opposed to the green-only chart. Initial reports indicate that the pilots conferred with dispatchers prior to heading towards the alternate airport. There was obviously a fairly significant failure of both the pilots and the dispatchers to consider the fuel state of the aircraft prior to the 370-mile leg. Wind and drag are the reasons given for the failure of the aircraft to make it to the alternate, but they missed it by 110 miles, so this sounds more like an excuse than a valid reason. And there's really no point in having a dispatcher if they can't quickly account for the winds aloft in a scenario like this. Still, the pilot should have known to ask questions. The flight management system would have undoubtedly indicated a fuel issue well before the point of no return. Odds are we're not going to get an answer on this one anytime soon. Russian crash investigations haven't proven to be entirely outside the arm of the Politburo. If the embargo had anything to do with it, you can bet that they'll not admit to it. In an interesting side note, officials have announced plans to repair the aircraft in place and then take it off from the field. They stated that aircraft engine damage due to FOD was minor after landing in the field. I'm not sure how they're planning to prepare the field prior to departure. Apply takeoff thrust on a CFM56 hanging a meter above the dirt, you're going to ingest a ton of debris and wreck the engine. For those of you who follow the channel and like the content, you can follow me on social media now as well. I'm going to produce shorter duration snippets over there. I'm dropping links in the comment section for this video. If you're watching on a touchscreen, it should also be a link up here. Some of you have also asked about Patreon, and I've opened an account over there. Based on the comment section, there's always additional interest in technical details of the accidents that I cover. I'll post docket links for all my research over there for those of you who want to dive into the details. My background in aviation safety, for those of you who don't know, is as an author. I've written for Twin and Turbine Magazine, Flying Magazine, and Redbird Flight Simulators. I do enough research on these videos that it makes sense to do articles and booklets as well. And if you sign up over at Patreon, you'll get those for free as they come out. Any theme I see in the comment sections over here, I'll address directly over there. And for those of you who join, if there's any content you'd like to see me focus on, I'll do it either over there or here on YouTube. I know that monetization can be a touchy subject, but if you want to support the channel, head over there and sign up. Thank you for watching, keep the blue side up, and we'll see you next time.